Hey Gun RPG fans, today I'm going to start a new series of videos called Dissecting the RPG, in which I talk about the various elements that makes an RPG great. For today's video, I'm going to talk about the final stretch, and I'm referring to the last part of the game. I like to break this into 4 different sections. The first one being the story event or the story sequence that leads the character to the final dungeon. The second section is the final dungeon itself, which leads to the third section, which is my favorite, the final battle, which then leads to the final and fourth section, the ending. Now, when all 4 done right is a very memorable and fulfilling experience. Getting one wrong and you kind of risk alienating the entire experience. You kind of compromise it. So I'm just going to give some examples. Originally, I was going to spoil some games talking about their final stretches, but I thought when I was pulling off games to refer to, which game had a fantastic final stretch, I ended up pulling off my nearly 50% of my entire shelf there, and I thought, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to give basic examples. So basically, the first section I was talking about was the story sequence. Now, this can be interpreted in many different ways. There's many different ways this can be told. This has to push the character to go and confront the villain. How this happens is many different ways. One, there could be a tragedy. Someone very close to the character is killed by the villain, and it just pushes the character over the edge and say, enough's enough, it ends here. You know, it could be an entire kingdom, an entire world destroyed by this character, and it just drives the main character to push him to that end. That's a different way, you know, using tragedy as the motivation to finally sort things out. It's one way that most RPGs do it. Another way they do it is equipment. You know, there could be a key item that the main character is missing that prevents him from going to the final dungeon, and when you get that key item, you can finally go there. Usually a typical one is the character has to find the ultimate weapon before he or she confronts the villain, which is one that's common, very cliche, but one I love. I always love those RPGs where you have to find the ultimate weapon, and finding the ultimate weapon in itself is an event that you just have that feeling of accomplishment, and you're just like, yes, I have it. Let's get down to business. You know, that's fantastic. Another one, you know, usually this is not at the final stretch. Usually it's somewhere near the end of the game as you find a means of transportation that takes you to those hard to reach places, including the final dungeon. So this can be, you know, like a flying creature like a dragon or a bird. It could be an airship, you know, it could be a transportation device, you know. All these little things. You just got to give the character the reason. I can't remember the last time I played a game where you just stumbled upon the final dungeon. I mean, if someone did that, if a game did that, it'd be bland, it'd be terrible beyond question. So there are plenty of great examples of what motivates the character or party of characters to confront the villain, and that's, you need that sequence to give the realization. Now this leads to the second section, which is the final dungeon. Now, I really enjoy final dungeons in RPGs. What really makes a great final dungeon is, well, one, it's got to look astounding. It's got to look like something that just, you know, your eyes just want to pop out when you look at it. It's just like, wow, this looks amazing. You know, some examples, it might be an air castle. It might be a structure out at outer space. You know, it could be, you know, the Neverworld. You're going down to the pits of hell. You could be going into another dimension. You know, all these, well, wonderful things. It's just got to be visually appealing. You just go, wow, I really am at the end of the game. And most games do that fantastically. Another element that makes a final dungeon great is music. You're going to hear this piece of music throughout the entirety of the dungeon, and it's just got to hit your face. It's got to hit your ears hard, that to the point that you just stop the game and you want to listen to it because it just sounds incredible. Most games do this and gives you the feeling that this is it. This is the final area of the game. I'm pumped. Let's go. Another thing that makes Final Dungeons great is the content. Now, I played a couple of games recently, and I can't remember off the top of my head. That's terrible that I've played so many RPGs that I forgot, where it just feels rushed. It might be like a couple of doors or a couple of rooms, not a challenge, not really worthy of calling a final dungeon. A good final dungeon is, it has to be bigger than any other dungeon or area in that entire game. It also needs to be challenging. It needs to offer challenges greater than anywhere else in the game. And it also has to have rewards. It needs to house items and equipment that will make the final battle more bearable or more easy. I really like it in games where you fight a sub-boss in the final dungeon and it's really difficult and you're struggling, and when you beat that boss, behind him or it drops a piece of equipment that just increases your stats incredibly. You just feel fantastic about, that you just worked hard to achieve this piece of equipment. And I really like it when Final Dungeons do that. They just provide so many opportunities to make your characters that much more better. Final Dungeons should have enemies that makes leveling up and grinding much more easier, and or in a case much more harder, where this is the last area that you want to grind in order for your characters to be ready to fight the final battle. And you also like it when enemies drop just standard. No, it doesn't have to be bosses, just standard enemies drop a piece of item you weren't expecting that will help you out in the long run. Just all these elements make a final dungeon great. And the final thing, some story events and sequences helps things along too, where one of the common ones I've seen in some RPGs where some characters will stay behind to fight off some enemies and let the other characters flee. um, you might find revelations within the final dungeon. You might find an area you can't get to yet, but you've gone to this other part of the final dungeon that opens up to the other part. That's also good too. Just many things that makes a final dungeon great. It just has to, when it comes down to it, it has to be better than every other area and dungeon in the game to make it truly great. Now, this is what I mainly want to talk about, and ever since I was a little kid, I appreciated this sequence more than any other sequence in an RPG, and that's the final battle. Now, I'm very critical when it comes to the final battle. It has to be something absolutely out of this world, where you've just played the entire game up until this point where the conflict is going to be resolved. A great final battle will have the final boss be someone relevant to the game. Now, I like it when a game has a villain from the start and he's the final boss. Now, not many games do this. I wish a lot more games would do this, but it's astounding to me how many final bosses are thrown into the mix at the very end of the game. It's not a good way of doing it because you haven't really built a connection with that character or that creature that just comes in the mix at the end. I prefer having, characters. I will refer to one character like Kefka from FF6. He's with you the entirety of the game. And then you find him at the end, you're just like, yeah, shit's gonna go down now, and it's gonna go down hard. And it feels great. Another term is Lassic from Phantasy Star. You don't see him until near the end of the game, but when you confront him, it is a big, even though it was a very simplistic RPG, it's a very big deal. And it just makes those sequences much more bearable. But a great final boss will not only be relevant to the story, he would be hard as balls too. Like, a great final boss will kill you the first session you have. I always find if I kill the boss on the first try, either I've grinded way too much, or he's just a cakewalk and wasn't even worth my time. Um, I prefer final bosses that are challenging and make you work towards beating it. Um, Final battles are great, not only just for the visual aspect of the boss, but the environment in which the final battle takes place. You know, where it be in some distant world, some distant dimension, where it be on the echelon of the structure where it's at, where it be atop a tower, you know, in the core of the planet. You know, it's just going to be a memorable place that just blends in nicely. You know, um, and of course, one thing I should never forget about, and this is very crucial to the final battle, and that's the music. The music needs to rock your socks off. It needs to be the number one track that the composer works his heart and soul into, where you're just like, wow, well, I just want to pause the game and listen to this. You know, the most known one by everyone is the One Winged Angel. I remember being, I think I was 11 or 12, and I just sat there. I can't pause the game because you pause the game, the music gets turned off. You just sat there and just going, wow, I've never heard anything like this before, and makes the experience much more memorable. I know every time I get a soundtrack, I always resist listening to the final boss, but sometimes I might listen. Excuse me, I might listen to the final boss track first, and if it's so good, that will inspire me to actually play the game itself. So I take it more seriously than anything else. So, and last but not least, the ending. Now, there's nothing worse when you've played a game that's so enjoyable, but the ending is so terrible, it just destroys everything. You know, there's some great games that have some great endings. Like whenever I think of a great ending, FF9 comes into mind. That's a fantastic ending. So Hartwin won't tell anyone what happens in the ending, but it's fantastic. Um, just there's so many games that have great endings. Some of the older RPGs might not have that great ending, but for its time, it might have been really good. Like I can't remember which game I'm going to refer to, but there is one game where after everything's done and said, they just dance in the dance in the castle. I know which game I'm talking about, so don't comment on me trying to tell me which game that is. But there's a game where they just dance, and I just don't like that. That's boring, even for those standards, you know. Um, but a great ending would have all the characters, feel validated, like they've accomplished something monumental. They've saved the world. They've, a great game will show everyone they've saved. They might finally be in the arms of the one they love. It just shows the change they've made and makes you feel good. There's some RPGs where they throw a twist in there, and that's really nice. One of my favorite endings of all time comes from Dragon Quest VIII. I love that ending, and I know there's two. I still need to actually witness the true ending of that game, but the ending that I witnessed, it was so fantastic, it was so heartwarming, and at the same time, there's a certain character that got his own, just like, yes! So, there you are. I'm actually running out of time. I knew this video would go on for a long time. I've got plenty more to say on this subject, but those are the four major areas that make a final stretch great and what makes an RPG worth playing for. So I really enjoy doing this video. I really have. This is one of the first videos I've done in a long time that I'm very happy with doing. I'm going to continue on with this series. The next dissection I'm going to do is going to be on the RPG villains. So I hope you can tune in for next time. See you guys.